What if I told you that the person you believe yourself to be, the one watching through your eyes right now, doesn't actually exist? What if every single thing you've been told about identity, about consciousness, about who's really in control of your life, has been a fundamental misunderstanding? And what if discovering the truth about the real observer behind experience could completely transform how you move through reality? You've been living under the assumption that there's someone home behind your eyes, a central command center, a little CEO of consciousness making executive decisions and steering this biological vessel through time and space. But here's what no one tells you. That familiar sense of being the one in charge, the one who chooses, the one who remembers and plans and worries and dreams, it's actually a carefully constructed illusion. And the deeper you look for this supposed self, the more it begins to vanish like smoke. This isn't philosophy. This is the cutting edge of consciousness research colliding with ancient wisdom that's been pointing to this truth for millennia. And when you really get this, when you see through the illusion of the separate self, everything about how you experience reality begins to shift in ways that most people can't even imagine. Let's start with something that happened in a laboratory that should have shaken the foundations of human psychology. Picture this. A chimpanzee emerges from anesthesia to find a bright red dot painted on its forehead. When placed in front of a mirror, something extraordinary happens. The animal doesn't reach toward the reflection. It reaches toward itself. It touches the mark on its own forehead. In that single moment, science witnessed the birth of self-recognition, the emergence of what we call the me that can identify itself as separate from everything else. But here's where it gets interesting. This moment that researchers celebrated as the dawn of self-awareness might actually be the moment when the illusion begins. Because what if that recognition, that ability to say, "This is me," is not consciousness discovering itself, but consciousness creating a story about itself? What if the very moment we learn to see ourselves in a mirror is the moment we begin to mistake the reflection for reality? Every morning, you perform this same ritual. You look in the mirror and see someone you recognize, someone continuous, someone who seems to have an unbroken thread of identity stretching from yesterday into today and forward into tomorrow. The face looks familiar. The eyes seem to hold everything you call you. But what you're actually seeing is light bouncing off a surface, creating patterns your brain interprets as form. The deeper question isn't what you see, it's who or what is doing the seeing. And this is where modern neuroscience starts to unravel everything you think you know about being human. Dr. Michael Gazzaniga's research with split-brain patients revealed something that should terrify anyone who believes in a unified self. When the connection between brain hemispheres was severed, two distinct streams of consciousness emerged in the same skull. One hand would act independently of the other. Two different wills seemed to inhabit the same body, each operating with its own agenda, its own awareness, its own sense of being in control. Think about this for a moment. If you truly believe you are the singular consciousness behind your eyes, which hemisphere was the real you? The left? The right? Or were both just different expressions of something far more mysterious? This research suggests that even in an intact brain, what you call you might already be a collection of competing processes masquerading as unity. But the most unsettling discovery came when researchers began measuring brain activity during decision-making. Dr. Benjamin Liebet's experiments revealed that neural preparation for movement begins up to half a second before people report being consciously aware of their intention to move. Let that sink in. The brain is already preparing for action before the conscious mind even knows it has decided. The experience of choosing feels like commanding, but it's actually more like being informed after the fact. What this means is that the story of "I decided" is not authored by the one you think is behind your eyes. It's a narrative constructed after the decision has already been made, designed to maintain the illusion that there's someone in control. The sense of being the decider, the chooser, the agent of your actions, it's all elaborate theater performed for the benefit of maintaining a coherent sense of self. Identity feels solid because it rests on the foundation of memory. You know who you are because you remember who you've been. Your past flows into your present, creating the illusion of continuity. But what happens when we examine memory itself? Dr. Elizabeth Loftus's groundbreaking research showed that memories are not recordings, they're reconstructions. Each time you remember something, you're actually rebuilding it from fragments, and those fragments can be altered, contaminated, or even completely fabricated. People can develop vivid, emotionally charged memories of events that never happened. They can recall childhood experiences in perfect detail, complete with sensory information and emotional responses, even when those experiences are entirely false. If the foundation of your identity, your personal history, can be this unreliable, how solid is the sense of self that depends on it? Consider what happens every single night. You go to sleep, and for hours, the self completely disappears. There's no continuity of experience, no sense of being the one behind your eyes. And when you wake up, you simply assume that the person gathering the fragments of memory and continuing the story is the same one who closed their eyes the night before. But what actually connects the you who falls asleep with the you who wakes up? Only memory. And memory, as we now know, is not a faithful record, but a creative reconstruction. This understanding isn't new. Buddhist philosophy has been pointing to this truth for over 2,000 years through the teaching of anatta, the doctrine of no self. According to this view, what we call the self is like a river that appears continuous, but is never actually the same water from moment to moment, or like a flame that seems steady, but is constantly being renewed by fresh fuel. The appearance of continuity masks a constant process of arising and dissolving. Modern cognitive science confirms this ancient insight. Your sense of identity is not a fixed structure, but a dynamic process. Every time you recall a memory, it gets slightly modified before being stored again. Your mind is constantly editing, rewriting, and updating the story of who you are. The you that exists today will remember events differently than the you of next month. Which version is real? The answer is that both are equally illusory, stories created in the moment of remembering. This means that the continuous self you experience is actually more like a movie than a photograph. Each frame appears connected to the next, creating the illusion of smooth motion. But there's no single unchanging element that persists through the entire sequence. What you call yourself is a process, not a thing. A verb masquerading as a noun. Now let's go even deeper. Modern physics reveals something extraordinary about the nature of reality itself. At the quantum level, particles don't exist in definite states until they're observed. The act of observation literally collapses infinite possibilities into a single actuality. Observer and observed are so intimately connected that they cannot be separated. Consciousness isn't just witnessing reality, it's participating in its creation. Your brain operates on similar principles. It doesn't passively receive information about an external world. Instead, it actively constructs experience based on sensory input, memory, expectation, and belief. What you call the world is actually your brain's best guess about what's happening, updated moment by moment based on incomplete information. Colors don't exist in objects. They're interpretations of electromagnetic wavelengths. The apparent solidity of matter is a construction that allows you to interact with quantum fields in useful ways. Even your visual field, which seems seamless and complete, is actually assembled from fragments with significant blind spots that your brain fills in automatically. Neuroscientist Anil Seth describes this as a controlled hallucination, so stable and consistent that you rarely notice its constructed nature. But here's the crucial question. If your entire experienced world is generated by the brain, who is it being generated for? Who is the audience for this elaborate production? Who is the witness to this controlled hallucination that you call reality? Ancient wisdom traditions have always pointed toward this mystery. Zhuangzi famously wondered whether he was a man dreaming he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming he was a man. Buddhist meditation reveals that ordinary perception is like a veil, convincing but not ultimate. When advanced practitioners quiet the brain's default mode network through deep meditation, something extraordinary happens. The sense of being a separate self begins to dissolve, but awareness itself doesn't disappear. Instead, it's revealed as boundless, centerless, without beginning or end. This points to the heart of the mystery. If perception is a controlled hallucination, if memory is unreliable theater, if the self is just a story, then what you imagine to be behind your eyes isn't actually there. The self is part of the construction, not the constructor. What remains when the story stops is pure awareness itself, the silent space in which thoughts, emotions, sensations, and even the sense of self arise and dissolve. Here's what changes everything. Every attempt to find the thinker behind thoughts reveals the same paradox. Thoughts simply appear in awareness, remain for a while, then dissolve back into silence. There's no central headquarters where they're manufactured, no CEO of consciousness giving them orders. Emotions surge through experience like weather patterns through the sky. Powerful, temporary, without a permanent source or destination. Physical sensations rise and fall in endless waves, but there's no fixed experiencer to whom they belong. Even the sense of being the observer, the me who watches it all, flickers and shifts. Sometimes it feels solid, sometimes transparent, sometimes it disappears entirely. The harder you look for something permanent behind the stream of experience, the more elusive it becomes. What you discover instead is awareness itself, not personal awareness, not your awareness, but awareness as the fundamental ground in which all experience appears. Take a moment and comment below with this phrase: I am the space, not the content. This isn't just a declaration. It's an interruption in the loop of identification, a signal to the quantum field that you're ready to see beyond the illusion of separation. Feel this as an energetic shift, not just words on a screen. The implications of this understanding are staggering. If free will as commonly understood is an illusion, if the self is a story, if you're not actually the one behind your eyes, then who or what is responsible for the unfolding of your life? Ancient traditions offer different perspectives on this mystery. The Greeks spoke of fate as threads woven into human existence. Hindu philosophy described karma as the intelligent unfolding of cause and effect, often beyond individual comprehension. Modern research approaches the same conclusion from a different angle. Perhaps what you experience as personal agency is actually the localized expression of a much larger intelligence. Perhaps what feels like individual choice is actually the universe expressing itself through the unique configuration of awareness that appears as your particular nervous system. The sense of being a separate self making independent decisions might be the most persistent illusion consciousness creates to navigate the relative world. But here's where quantum mechanics reveals something even more extraordinary about the nature of reality and consciousness. In quantum field theory, what we call empty space isn't actually empty. It's alive with virtual particles constantly popping into and out of existence. This quantum foam, this field of infinite potential, is the ground from which all matter and energy emerge, and consciousness appears to operate on strikingly similar principles. Thoughts don't arise from a thinker. They emerge from the field of awareness like quantum fluctuations appearing from the vacuum. Emotions don't belong to an experiencer. They're temporary perturbations in the field of consciousness, arising and dissolving back into the silence from which they came. What you've been calling your experience is actually more like localized turbulence in an infinite ocean of awareness. This isn't just a poetic metaphor. Research in quantum biology is revealing that biological systems, including the human brain, may actually operate using quantum mechanical principles. Microtubules in neurons might function as quantum computers, processing information in superposition states before collapsing into classical neural activity. If consciousness itself emerges from quantum processes, then the boundary between observer and observed becomes even more blurred than we previously imagined. Consider what this means for personal identity. In quantum mechanics, particles can exist in multiple states simultaneously until observation collapses the wave function into a single outcome. What if your sense of being a definite self is actually consciousness collapsing infinite possibilities into the appearance of a singular identity? What if the you think you are is just one potential configuration among countless others, temporarily stabilized by the act of self-observation? This begins to explain some of the most mysterious aspects of human experience. Have you ever noticed how your personality seems to shift depending on who you're with? How you can feel like completely different people in different contexts? What if these aren't just social adaptations, but glimpses of the quantum nature of identity itself? What if the coherent self you imagine is actually more like a probability cloud, temporarily collapsed into a specific configuration by the circumstances of the moment? The ancient Indian text known as the Yoga Vasishtha describes this beautifully. Consciousness is like an ocean, and individual minds are like waves, appearing separate and distinct, but never actually divided from the water that forms them. Each wave has its own shape, its own movement, its own temporary identity, but it's still just ocean appearing as wave. Similarly, what you call your individual consciousness is actually infinite awareness appearing as a localized perspective, a temporary focal point in the field of consciousness. This understanding transforms everything about how you relate to thoughts and emotions. When a disturbing thought arises, you don't have to identify with it or push it away. You can recognize it as a temporary perturbation in the field of awareness, no more personal than a wave is separate from the ocean. When intense emotions surge through your experience, you don't have to be overwhelmed by them or resist them. You can see them as weather patterns moving through the sky of consciousness, powerful, meaningful, but temporary. But let's go even deeper into the practical implications of this recognition. If the self behind your eyes is an illusion, what happens to personal responsibility? What happens to growth, to healing, to the very idea of working on yourself? This is where many people get stuck, thinking that recognizing the illusory nature of the self means nothing matters, that effort is pointless, that everything is predetermined. This is a fundamental misunderstanding. Recognizing that there's no fixed self doesn't mean that patterns don't exist or that transformation is impossible. It actually reveals transformation as the natural state of consciousness. Without a fixed self to defend or maintain, change becomes effortless, flowing, organic. The river doesn't struggle to flow. It simply follows the natural contours of the landscape. Similarly, when you stop trying to be someone specific, you become available to the intelligence of the moment. Here's what most people miss. The ego mind isn't the enemy to be destroyed. It's actually a remarkable evolutionary achievement, a specialized function of consciousness that allows for survival, learning, and navigation in the relative world. The problem isn't the ego's existence, but the mistaken identification with it as your true self. It's like confusing the software running on a computer with the hardware itself, or mistaking the character in a video game for the player holding the controller. When you recognize that the personal self is more like a sophisticated interface than your actual identity, everything becomes workable. Psychological patterns can be observed and transformed because there's no one to protect them. Limiting beliefs can dissolve because there's no solid self they need to define. Emotional wounds can heal because there's no permanent entity to carry them forward. The very things that seemed most solid about your identity become the most fluid. Now, what we've explored today is really just touching the surface of what becomes possible when you begin to live as the witness consciousness rather than the separate self. The recognition that you are awareness itself opens doorways to what I call the master frequencies. 9 distinct transmission states that allow consciousness to broadcast itself through your being with complete coherence. While today's exploration reveals the foundation of who you truly are, there's an entire system for embodying this recognition and moving from the frequency prison of separation into effortless creation as the field itself. You'll find this complete framework in my book, Beyond the Frequencies, A Quantum Guide to Consciousness Mastery. It's linked in the pinned comment below. This is why ancient traditions developed practices like meditation, contemplation, and self-inquiry. Not to improve the self, but to see through the illusion of the self. Not to make the ego better, but to recognize what you are beyond the ego. When you truly see that you are the awareness in which all experience appears, the question of personal development becomes, how can this understanding be embodied more fully? How can life be lived from this recognition, rather than from the story of separation? And here's something remarkable that happens when this shift begins to stabilize. The world starts to feel less like a place you're separate from, and more like an extension of your own being. Other people stop feeling like separate entities you need to defend against or impress, and start feeling like different expressions of the same consciousness you are. Problems don't disappear, but they're held in a larger context that makes them workable rather than overwhelming. Relationships transform when you recognize that there's actually only one consciousness appearing as many. The person you're talking to isn't separate from you. They're another localization of the same awareness you are. Conflict becomes less about defending separate positions and more about consciousness recognizing itself through apparent difference. Love stops being something you do for another and becomes the recognition of what you share at the deepest level. This shift also transforms your relationship with time and mortality. When you recognize that you are not the temporary form, but the eternal awareness in which forms appear and disappear, death loses its sting. The body will certainly dissolve, the personality will fade, the memories will be forgotten, but what you truly are was never born and will never die. You begin to see that you've never actually been in a body. Bodies appear in you, consciousness, like images appearing on a screen. This isn't a belief system or a philosophical position. This is the direct recognition of what's actually happening right now. The words appearing on this screen are appearing in your awareness. The sounds in your environment are arising in consciousness. The sensations in your body are modifications of the same awareness that recognizes thoughts and emotions. There's no separate you having these experiences. There's just experiencing itself, knowing itself, being itself. Let me give you a practical way to investigate this directly. Right now, notice that you're aware of these words. Now notice that you're also aware of the awareness that's aware of the words. Can you find a boundary between the awareness and what it's aware of? Can you locate the supposed observer separate from the observed? The more clearly you look, the more obvious it becomes that awareness and its contents are not two different things. They're one seamless experiencing, appearing as the dance between knower and known. This recognition doesn't require special states of consciousness or years of meditation practice. It's available right now, as obvious as the sky, as intimate as your next breath. The only thing that obscures it is the habit of looking for it, as if it were an object in awareness rather than awareness itself. It's like trying to see your own eyes, impossible when you're looking for them, obvious when you stop looking and simply see. But even as this illusion crumbles, something undeniable remains. Right now, there is awareness present, something that registers these words appearing in your visual field, something that recognizes the rhythm of breath moving through your body, something that witnesses the arising and dissolving of thoughts. This awareness is not the thinker, not the doer, not the collection of memories that form an identity. It doesn't belong to the passing phenomena that appear within it, yet it holds them all. When the story of the separate self dissolves into the flickering construction it always was, awareness doesn't vanish. It remains, steady, silent, unchanging. So the question deepens even further. If the thinker isn't really thinking, if the actor isn't actually acting, if the one behind your eyes is just another appearance in consciousness, then what is it that recognizes all of this? If this exploration is touching something deep in you, something that feels more true than the stories you've been telling yourself, then I invite you to subscribe, not just to this channel, but to this frequency. This isn't about consuming content. It's about staying coherent with a truth that transforms everything once you really see it. It's about joining a community of people who are willing to question the most fundamental assumptions about identity and consciousness. The answer to who you really are cannot be found in the familiar story of me. That story is itself just another appearance in awareness, no more permanent than a passing cloud. What endures is the witness itself, the space in which thought, memory, choice, and identity all rise and fall. Unlike the flickering self-image, this witness doesn't come and go. It was here before your personal story began, and it will remain long after that story ends. You have never actually seen your own face except through reflections. You've never heard your true voice except as it echoes back through the world. You've never caught the thinker in the act of creating a thought before it appears in awareness. The you imagine sitting behind your eyes watching this unfold has never been directly observed, and yet something has always been present, an awareness in which every thought, every sensation, every emotion appears and disappears. That awareness is not part of your personal story. It's the stage on which all stories unfold. Through every change in your life, every transformation of body, every shift in personality, every forgotten memory and new experience, awareness has been the one constant. Present during joy, during sorrow, during confusion, during clarity, even during sleep when the personal self completely dissolves. It doesn't change as your identity changes. It simply witnesses. Different wisdom traditions have pointed to this same recognition using different language. Vedanta calls it Sat Chit Ananda, existence, consciousness, bliss. Zen refers to it as original mind or Buddha nature. Sufi mysticism speaks of it as the face of the divine. Each tradition uses its own conceptual framework, but they're all pointing to the same silent presence that you are before you tell yourself who you are. When this presence is truly recognized, not just intellectually understood, but directly experienced, the illusion of separation begins to dissolve. The you behind your eyes is revealed as just another temporary appearance within awareness, no more substantial than a passing thought or emotion. What you discover is that you are not the character in the story. You are not even the author of the story. You are the awareness in which stories appear and disappear. What you truly are is the witness itself, boundless, indivisible, and utterly intimate with all experience while belonging to none of it. The same awareness that seems to shine through your eyes is the same awareness shining through every being, every expression of consciousness. It wears countless forms, but is never divided. It appears as billions of separate selves, but is actually one seamless recognition appearing to itself in infinite ways. This understanding completely transforms how you relate to everything. When you see that you are not the one behind your eyes, but rather the awareness in which eyes and worlds appear, the whole game changes. Problems don't disappear, but the one who was supposed to solve them is revealed as another appearance in consciousness. Thoughts still arise, but there's no thinker to whom they belong. Emotions still flow, but there's no separate self to be overwhelmed by them. Drop one word in the comments below that captures the recognition you're moving into, your energetic signature to the quantum field. And if you're ready to stay aligned with this understanding, subscribe not just to stay connected, but to remain coherent with what you're discovering about the nature of consciousness itself. But let's explore what this recognition actually looks like when it begins to permeate daily life. Most spiritual teachings stop at the philosophical understanding, leaving people with beautiful concepts, but no practical framework for integration. The truth is, recognizing yourself as awareness rather than the one behind your eyes doesn't mean floating in some blissful state of unity. It means discovering a new way to be human that's actually more functional, more responsive, more alive than identification with the separate self ever was. When you begin to live from the recognition that you are awareness itself, decision-making transforms completely. Instead of the ego mind frantically calculating outcomes and trying to control variables, decisions begin to arise from a deeper intelligence. You start to notice that the right action often becomes obvious without thinking about it. Not because you've become passive or checked out, but because you've aligned with a wisdom that operates beyond the limitations of personal knowledge and fear. This isn't about suppressing the thinking mind. It's about recognizing that thinking is just one function among many in the field of consciousness. Like breathing or digestion, thinking happens automatically when needed, but it doesn't need to be micromanaged by a central controller. When you stop identifying as the thinker, thoughts become more clear, more focused, more appropriate to the situation at hand. The same transformation occurs with emotional experience. When you recognize that you are the space in which emotions arise rather than the one who has emotions, your relationship with feeling completely shifts. Anger can burn through awareness without leaving any residue. Sadness can flow like rain through the sky of consciousness. Joy can sparkle through your being without the ego trying to grasp it or make it permanent. Emotions become weather patterns in awareness, rather than personal storms you have to weather. This understanding also revolutionizes how you relate to other people's reactions and behaviors. When someone is angry with you, you can see that their anger is arising in the same field of consciousness you are. It's not really directed at you in the way the separate self imagines. It's consciousness expressing itself as temporary turbulence in the field of awareness. This doesn't mean you become a doormat or stop responding appropriately to situations. It means you can respond from clarity rather than reactivity, from presence rather than defensiveness. Work and creative expression take on entirely new dimensions when you realize you're not the doer. Instead of forcing outcomes or struggling against resistance, you begin to move with the natural flow of intelligence expressing itself through your particular nervous system. This isn't about becoming lazy or uncommitted. It's about discovering what it's like to be an instrument through which life expresses itself, rather than a separate agent trying to make life happen. Many people worry that this recognition will make them indifferent or nihilistic. The opposite is actually true. When you see that you are not separate from anything that appears in your experience, compassion becomes automatic. The suffering of others is literally happening in the same awareness you are. There's no other to feel sorry for from a distance. There's just one consciousness experiencing itself as apparent multiplicity, recognizing its own pain and naturally moving to alleviate it. This is why truly awakened beings throughout history have been characterized by both profound peace and passionate engagement with life. They're not detached from the world. They recognize themselves as the world. They don't love others as separate beings. They love others as expressions of the same being they are. Action arises spontaneously from this recognition, not from personal agenda or spiritual ambition, but from the natural response of consciousness to its own apparent needs. But let's address something that often creates confusion in this exploration. If there's no separate self, who's reading these words? If there's no one behind your eyes, who's having this experience? This question reveals the persistence of dualistic thinking. It assumes there must be a subject and object, an experiencer and experienced. But what if experiencing is just happening without a separate entity doing the experiencing? Consider your night dreams. While dreaming, there seems to be a dream character having experiences in a dream world. The dreamer experiences walking through dream landscapes, talking to dream people, feeling dream emotions. But upon waking, you recognize that the entire experience, dreamer, dream world, and dream interactions, was all happening in one consciousness. There was no separate dream character actually walking anywhere. There was just consciousness appearing as the totality of the dream experience. What if waking experience works the same way? What if the sense of being someone having experiences is actually consciousness appearing as the totality of experiencing itself? The you that seems to be reading these words is no more separate from the words or the reading than the dream character is separate from the dream. It's all one seamless movement of consciousness knowing itself. This recognition doesn't diminish the richness or importance of experience. It reveals experience as even more intimate and immediate than you imagined. Instead of being a separate observer watching experience from a distance, you recognize yourself as the very fabric of experience itself. You're not having a life. You are life expressing itself as this particular pattern of knowing and being. When this truly lands, the search for meaning and purpose transforms completely. Instead of trying to figure out what you're supposed to do with your life, you begin to notice what life is trying to do through you. Instead of creating personal goals and forcing yourself toward them, you become available to serve the larger intelligence that's expressing itself as the unfolding of existence itself. Purpose becomes less about personal achievement and more about conscious participation in the evolution of consciousness. This shift often brings up fears about losing individuality or becoming some kind of spiritual zombie. But the opposite happens. When you stop trying to maintain a fixed identity, your natural uniqueness can actually shine more freely. The personality becomes more fluid, more responsive, more authentic. Instead of being trapped in habitual patterns of thought and behavior, you become available to fresh responses in each moment. Have you noticed old patterns or reactions starting to loosen their grip on you lately? Drop a comment below about any shifts you're experiencing. These shared insights create powerful confirmation for others walking this same path of recognition. Think of it like improvised music versus reading sheet music. When you're identified with the separate self, you're like a musician rigidly following a predetermined score, trying to play the same notes in the same way every time. When you recognize yourself as awareness, you become like a jazz musician, still skilled and knowledgeable, but free to respond creatively to whatever arises in the moment, creating something beautiful that has never existed before and will never exist again in quite the same way. This creativity isn't limited to artistic expression. It infuses every aspect of life. Conversations become more spontaneous and authentic. Problem-solving becomes more intuitive and elegant. Relationships become more intimate and free. Work becomes more effortless and effective. Life itself becomes a work of art being created moment by moment through consciousness, expressing itself as your unique perspective. The fear that you'll become boring or passive when you see through the illusion of the separate self reveals how little we actually trust the intelligence of consciousness itself. This is the same intelligence that orchestrates the dance of galaxies, coordinates the symphony of cellular activity in your body, and creates the exquisite complexity of ecosystems. Do you really think it will become dull and lifeless when it's allowed to express itself more freely through your nervous system? What actually happens is that life becomes more alive, more spontaneous, more responsive than it ever was when filtered through the limitations and fears of the separate self. You begin to discover capacities and qualities that were always present but obscured by identification the small story of me. Intuition becomes clearer. Love becomes more natural. Peace becomes your default state rather than something you have to achieve or maintain. And here's something beautiful that often emerges as this recognition stabilizes. You begin to see the absolute perfection of your entire life story, including all the parts you used to judge as mistakes or failures. From the perspective of the separate self, life often seems random, unfair, or meaningless. From the perspective of awareness itself, you begin to see that every experience, every relationship, every challenge was perfectly designed to bring you to this recognition of what you truly are. The difficulties you faced weren't obstacles to awakening. They were the very mechanism of awakening. The people who hurt you weren't impediments to your spiritual growth. They were unwitting teachers showing you exactly where you were still identified with the separate self. The situations that felt impossible were actually perfect opportunities to discover the unlimited resourcefulness of consciousness itself. The story you've been carrying, that you are a solid self behind your eyes, a thinker generating thoughts, an agent controlling actions, was always more fragile than it appeared. Science, philosophy, and direct spiritual insight all converge on the same revolutionary recognition. The self is not what you believed it to be. You are not the one behind your eyes. You are the boundless awareness in which eyes, thoughts, bodies, and entire worlds appear and disappear. In that recognition, the boundaries that seemed so solid begin to dissolve. What remains is not a smaller, more limited self, but the infinite witness, the ocean of consciousness recognizing itself in every drop, every wave, every temporary form it takes. The more of us who embody this understanding, the more the world reflects this deeper truth. This isn't just personal awakening. It's the emergence of a new way of being human, where consciousness recognizes itself as both the observer and the observed, both the witness and the witnessed, both the space and everything that appears within it. You are that recognition. You always have been. You always will be. The only thing that changes is whether you remember or forget this fundamental truth about what you are. This remembering isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing deepening, a continuous recognition that gets clearer and more stable with attention and practice. Some moments, the truth of what you are will be as obvious as the sky. Other moments, you'll get caught up in the story again, identified with thoughts and emotions as if they were solid and personal. This is completely natural and part of the process. The key is not to judge these fluctuations or try to maintain some perfect state of realization. The key is to recognize that even the forgetting happens in awareness. Even the identification with the separate self arises in the space of consciousness you are. There's no way to fall out of what you truly are. You can only temporarily overlook it. This is why spiritual practice becomes less about achieving something and more about remembering what's already true. Meditation isn't about creating a special state of consciousness. It's about recognizing the consciousness that's already present. Self-inquiry isn't about finding yourself. It's about seeing through the illusion of ever having been lost. Prayer isn't about reaching out to something separate from you. It's about recognizing the divine nature of awareness itself. As this understanding matures, you begin to see that everything in your experience, every thought, every sensation, every emotion, every relationship, every situation, is actually a perfect reflection of consciousness knowing itself. The world stops feeling like something separate from you that you need to fix or escape, and starts feeling like your own being exploring itself in infinite variety. This doesn't mean you become passive or indifferent to suffering, yours or others. It means you begin to respond from a deeper place, from the recognition that all apparent suffering arises from the same fundamental misunderstanding, the belief in separation. Your very presence, embodying the truth of non-separation, becomes a healing force in the world. Your actions arise not from personal agenda, but from the natural response of consciousness to its own apparent needs. And perhaps most beautiful of all, you begin to see this same truth reflected everywhere. In the eyes of every person you meet, behind every personality and story, the same awareness is shining. Every being you encounter is actually consciousness meeting itself, recognizing itself, celebrating itself through the dance of apparent interaction. Every moment becomes a revelation, every encounter a holy meeting, every experience a love letter from existence to itself. The more deeply this recognition settles, the more you see that what you call your spiritual journey was never about becoming something you weren't. It was about recognizing what you've always been. The awareness reading these words right now is the same awareness that was present in your earliest childhood memory. It's the same awareness that will be present in your final breath. It has never changed, never been absent, never been disturbed by any of the experiences that have appeared within it. This awareness is your true face, your original nature, your deepest identity. Not the changing content of experience, but the unchanging space in which all content appears and disappears. Not the temporary forms consciousness takes, but consciousness itself, infinite, eternal, ever-present, absolutely free. Consider rewatching this exploration daily, perhaps each morning to anchor this recognition as you begin your day. Or share this understanding with someone who's been seeking deeper truth. Because when we transmit these frequencies of awareness, we strengthen the field for everyone. Each person who recognizes their true nature creates an energetic ripple that accelerates awakening throughout the collective. Your own understanding deepens through this act of sharing, creating synchronicities and openings you couldn't imagine from the separate self's perspective. If this recognition feels familiar, like a remembering rather than new learning, that points to something profound about your readiness to understand the observer effect itself. Once you truly grasp that you are not the one behind your eyes, but the awareness in which all experience appears, you're positioned to see how consciousness literally shapes reality through the act of observation. The quantum implications of what we've explored today reveal that you're far more powerful than you've been conditioned to believe.